Hi.
Hello. Right, let's get bits and pieces up. Lovely. 3 people here already. I did a really quick, it was meant to be a really quick, and it was about half an hour in the end. It was going to be like a bite-sized Aucademy, just to let people know that we were on tonight, get people used to the fact that we're on at 7 p.m. now instead of 8. So hopefully people remembered. But I ended up on there for about half an hour because I asked a question and there was lots of great answers, and I was like, oh no, I'm stuck. Lovely. 14 already.
There's quite a lag on screen sometimes with the numbers, aren't there?
Yeah. People who are coming in, our normal thing is to hold on for a minute or so until the room fills up nicely. So hello, Amy, Laurel. Sharing is send caring. It's Victoria. Yep, lovely. So Victoria popped on during my impromptu live earlier. So they're from Sharing is Send Caring. And so they were particularly interested in hopping on. Ellie, Jude, Alice.
Hi, Alice.
18 people. Lovely. So hello, people. We'll keep waiting for the room to fill up, but we can do some brief introductions. I am Chloe Farahar, and I am joined today by Tanya Adkins from Send Family Instincts.
Yeah. Is that Sai in the background?
It is Sai in the background. Sai is going to man the chat box for me. So if there's any questions that are useful, I think you have, is it Jess that does that for you?
Yeah, we have Jess, Charlie, yeah.
To grab good questions to pop them up on the screen. If anyone doesn't, if you'd rather your questions weren't obviously displayed on the screen, but you still want to ask in question, just say, I don't know, don't display or something right at the start. So, but it is nice. It's quite useful to be able to see the questions. Hello, Victoria, 23, lovely, building up. So today our topic is EHCPs and SEND and the support for our young autistic people in schools. And I think 25, we'll start. We'll have a nice start.
I wish it could be a conversation, but unfortunately it's not very. But there we go, We
try to end on a happy note by asking a particularly nice autistic question, just because sometimes topics are quite difficult topics. So I know I've already introduced you and you are Tanya Adkins, but who are you and what are your dedicated interests?
So I am a late discovered autistic advocate, and that happened because of my children's discovery. And of course, naturally, what you do when you're autistic, even if you don't know it, is research. And then all of a sudden a light bulb happens and you're like, oh, damn, that's me. So that kind of happened to me. And there was support for my children at that particular time when they were struggling. So I, again, like any autistic would do, deep dived into law and policy and how to access that support. And then a few years down the line, I figured, damn, I should maybe formalize this. And 6 years later, here I am with Jess Kane at Send Family Instincts. We're both neurodivergent, and we help parents navigate the education and healthcare plan systems, social care, to try and get the support that their children need in order to thrive in education. So yeah.
And how long has Send Family Instincts been going? Because it's not very long either, is it? Like Aucademy.
So Jess and I, we worked together. So we worked separately, but we worked together. But we joined forces in January. So it's quite new, but it's just grown massively and the support's been immense. I didn't actually realise there was a niche for actual autistic led advocacy until it happened, and I was like, oh wow, okay, this is really important. So it didn't really occur to me.
And I know because Victoria, I think, who is from that Sharing is Send Caring, is potentially very interested in, because they're saying strengthening unity, so there might be some matching up, because I know that you're all inundated, aren't you, with the amount of
we
need
yeah
for your services?
we work really closely with the Gecko community, which are an alternative provider and mental health and wellbeing service for neurodivergent children that are out of school for one reason or another. And they have a waiting list. Jodie Smitten as well, who is an autistic children's wellbeing kind of advisor. We are really inundated, and it's really sad, but we're struggling.
Yeah. And I think that's my first real introduction to you was, for an EHCP meeting for a young autistic person.
Yeah.
And just realizing, because I was like, I don't know anything about, we'll start to talk in a minute about what even is an EHCP, and particularly if anyone is here who's not from the UK, for instance, won't necessarily know what that is, and they'll have something slightly different. But I didn't know enough at all, and anywhere near even basic information about what they are and what they do. So I was there very much more in the capacity of, I understand autistic experience, so I can explain some of those points. But yeah, your knowledge was just very clear that you, as an autistic person, had gone and done your research to really try and help in that meeting, to be on the side of the parent, which...
Well, child, really, ultimately. I mean, sometimes it means that we disagree with parents, and that's okay too. But I think that what's missing from kind of advocacy in EHCPs and social care is actually understanding autistic experience. For me, it's a very ableist system because it's all based on deficit, but it needs to be, because that's how it works. But it's a difficult system to navigate, but then to also not have, you've got to have autistic experience in there as well. And I think the difficulty is with the system is that because, you know, being autistic is a hidden thing and children quite often mask, it means that unfortunately local authorities have no money. So what happens is that they try and wiggle out of providing what they should, and the people that are at the brunt of that essentially are the children and the families. So,
and I think that came across as quite apparent and frustrating when I sat in that meeting. And just, why is this all focusing on the need for the child to be the element that changes? That made no sense to me. You are talking about a disabled child, because in the UK, if you are diagnosed autistic, you are classified technically as disabled. You know, then we could go into a whole other discussion about it's the social model of disability. We're disabled because of the environment. But, you know, they're talking about how do we, expectations for the child to change. And you are talking about an autistic or multiply neurodivergent child, so not just autistic, they might have attention differences and other, other neurological profiles. And they're talking about trying to change that. And it's like, you literally can't. It makes no sense to be talking about changing the child.
It's wrong, and I think that's probably why there aren't more autistic people in this area, because essentially the system is completely flawed. It's based on identifying a need, prescribing provision to meet that need in order to end up with a child that is gold standard, which is neurotypical and attending mainstream like the rest of the neurotypicals, which is never going to happen. And that's what I found with my own children. And that's why I kind of deep dived it and was like, okay, there's got to be a way that we can make this system work for neurodivergent people and children, because EHCPs do go up to 25 as well. But yeah, it is literally a legal process and a minefield. If you have a child, if you have a disabled child, sorry.
Have you got any water? I'm like that. I've got such a sensitive uvula.
Yeah. So if you have a disabled child, the gold standard is going to be neurotypical. And it's kind of like a really unfortunate part of you are literally going to have to fight for everything, whether that be benefits or education or support or social care, because we're in a position where we have policies that read really well, You know, we have things like the Equality Act, we have things like the SEND Code of Practice, we have the Children's and Families Act, and they read really well. But ultimately, if everybody exercised those rights legally, we would be bankrupt. And that's where we are.
Yeah, right. Okay, let's start from the beginning then. So I think it might sound obvious, but we're gonna go from the scratch from dot. Right. So what are the difficulties for neurodivergent, i.e. autistic, attention differences children in schools? So what are we seeing with our young people?
So the majority of the difficulties that we see in schools is that schools essentially are not set up for individuality in any way, or individual needs, and they need everybody to kind of like tick a box. So sensory differences quite often is the biggest barrier to education. When it comes to the crunch, and when you've got a child that may know they're autistic but doesn't understand what that really means, it can create problems because they will still compare themselves to their neurotypical peers. Another barrier obviously is because you know, teachers have very, very little training budgets, so they don't understand neurodiversity in the way that we do because we live it. I mean, I frequently have to explain to teachers what masking is, what fawning is, what proprioceptive input might be. So it seems to create, and because autistic children mask as well, because they don't feel safe in a school environment, they often fawn and just make it through the day. And then when they get home, that's when things fall to pieces. And what that's creating then is, oh, well, the problem must be at home then, because that's where the behaviour is.
And I just quickly made a note. So the things that you said at the start, so there's types of difficulties and the things that those schools really still don't understand, that we in the community see as sort of basic understanding, which is, you said masking and fawning. I feel like you said something else and I was going to make a note. Was there something else and I missed it?
Yeah, it's masking, fawning, sensory differences. Just basically they don't understand autistic experience. Because they're only ever really as good as the last training that they accessed, and their budgets are really, really low, and it's not personal. It's not. It literally is a budget and education kind of thing. Same with local authorities. It's not personal. It comes down to budget. But they could probably afford to send one teacher on some training that's delivered by the cheapest place, and they're just seeking out autism training that probably isn't neurodivergent led and is 20 years old and missing a lot of things, and then they've got a child that is fine in school but then not fine at home. So of course then comes in things like parent blaming, fee, which is fabricated in induced illness, and a lot of social care problems, and that's what we're seeing a lot of, and that's on a daily basis. Or you know, worse, we have, I think the youngest child that we've had with attempts to take their own life is probably 6. So yeah, it's pretty gnarly. But and it literally comes down to either not understanding autistic experience or watching the money so robustly that they don't want to give specialist school placements or support because they can't afford it. So yeah, that's where we are. It's quite grim, sorry.
Yeah, and I think going back to maybe the masking, fawning and sensory differences then, like, because you just mentioned they're not even understanding that. And even when, you know, I sat on that EHCP meeting with you and the mum, who's also neurodivergent, and the mum's friend, who's also neurodivergent. And we were the most knowledgeable in that meeting on all the things related to autistic experience, and from your perspective, the legality of EHCP as well. And they still, even though they've been told multiple times about masking, still kept referring to, but she's doing fine at school. And they are ignoring the fact, or just what I guess is frustrating is something that I do try to talk about in training, which is that we aren't static. We aren't these human beings, as autistic human beings, that are just presenting in one way all the time. Like any other human being, we are very variable, complex beings. So they seem to really struggle with this idea that an autistic person is capable of, via a survival mechanism, hiding their autistic selves. And I think a lot of that is built on that, the stereotypes and the myths that we should be a certain way. And then, like you say, then it means they go home, they're in a safe place, or they just can't hold it in anymore, and they're going to have meltdowns and quite extreme mental health responses. And what about fawn? Oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just saying, and 99% of the time, it would be avoidable by essentially giving an autistic child very, very simple accommodations. The thing is, sometimes these people do know what we're talking about. There is just a deniability because of the funding aspect, because those autistic needs can't necessarily be met in a mainstream environment because of the busyness and the change in the structure. But then you're looking at a specialist placement, and that may cost upwards of £60,000 a year. And then you get into the whole politics of it, where schools are kind of beholden to the local authority, so they don't want to upset them. And ultimately, what you've got at the centre of it is a child that is really struggling and experiencing significant mental health problems because their needs aren't being met. And then comes in parent blaming, and then comes in social services accusations, and then comes it, and it literally just snowballs to avoid paying for what that child needs.
I'm going to make a note so that I can come back to it. Hold on. About the fabricated and induced illness. Going back to what you just said, that the actual accommodations that need to be put in place, I also feel that they don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money or even take up a lot of resources. So have you got any, I mean, you will, but what kind of accommodations are we talking about?
So I think what's missing, and I think this is a very neurotypical thing, whether it be parenting or the way that people should parent or teaching or whatever it is very control based. As neurodivergent people, we don't do well with that kind of pressure and expectation. We mask, but we burn out eventually to the point that we can't be in that environment. So by the time that the children get to us, they are no longer able to be in that environment because they've masked for so long that they can't necessarily tolerate a class of 30. But if these accommodations and some flexibility was put in initially, and schools had a really good understanding of what neurodivergence was, what it looked like, what it meant, then we'd probably avoid where we are now, which is 15,000 children with EHCPs, so gone through the fight to secure an EHCP, but not got a school placement. So they're missing from education, even with the EHCP. So then look at, like, what about the kids that have been off-rolled? So off-rolling is a big problem. Where, so off-rolling is ultimately, if you have a disabled child or a child with special educational needs, the local authority is responsible for their education. But what happens is when you've got a neurodivergent child going through mainstream and it's not going well, what will happen is local authorities and schools will try and convince the parent that their only option is home education. Because once the parent then deregisters the child from school, the local authority have no responsibility for that child's education. And that, so you kind of, as a parent, you're kind of stuck. If you have a neurodivergent child that is struggling in education, you can either do the EHCP and have the battle, or you can home educate, and then you have an entirely separate but equally stressful set of problems, because you've then got the home education team on your back. Are you meeting their needs? Let's show me the work. What are you doing? How is it structured? What are they achieving? So we're kind of stuck, really.
And I guess even if the child would be better off at home, being educated at home, that's not going to be feasible for a lot of families as well. So it's just a system not set up to support neurodivergent families.
It's not. There are ways around it. I mean, for example, if a child is better off educated at home, then there is something called the OTAS, which is education otherwise than at school. And if the local authority maintains responsibility, then that is something that is achievable via a package. And it can be done, and it's done quite frequently for a lot of neurodivergent children who have got to the point where they've experienced so much trauma from attending school that that's just not an option for them anymore. But the fight that you have to produce to get to that level, because the gold standard is always neurotypical mainstream school. So the whole system is set up to get these children back into mainstream education and to be neurotypical. And what can we do to support them to be neurotypical? So yeah, it's a mess.
And like I say, that is just a losing battle. Even if you could manage, and I really don't, none of us want this for our young autistic people. You know, even if that school could manage to get that child to mask and appear neurotypical, they are not neurotypical.
Okay.
You can never make us not autistic. You can make us, you know, you can support us to be happier, thriving autistic people or struggling autistic people, but masked or not, we are autistic. So I think, and I mean, the whole situation is
It's
just entirely.
Yeah, it is. But I mean, there are things that you can do. There are ways to get around it. But ultimately, you've got to think from a parental perspective. All of a sudden, you've got an autistic child who can no longer attend school, and then they're being threatened with fines and being told they're fine in school and there's nothing wrong, and then the parenting starts coming into question. You know, it's a legal process. It's an EHCP, an education and healthcare plan, is literally a legal document, and a contract between you and the local authority of what they're legally going to deliver. So you've essentially got a parent that is trying their best to support a child while being pressured by school, being told and constantly gaslit that there's nothing wrong with their child and they're fine in school, then having their parenting questioned, and then the only option they've really got is to pursue a legal process, which could potentially take up to 2 years with appeals. We are literally, it's bottlenecked. There's no other option really, apart from home education, which then comes with its same set of equal problems.
Okay, I know, because I want to get on to also, we can detail what is an EHCP as well, because we haven't got to that bit either. I don't want to go into too much detail because I do actually have another guest on in a few weeks' time who's going to talk about autistic parents and, for instance, being accused of fabricated and induced illness. But do you want to just touch on that, because you did mention it?
FII is literally, well, it started off as Munchausen's by proxy, which is actually a diagnosis, which has very, very few incidents of. But I think it was Royal College of Pediatrics that produced something called fabricated and induced illness, which has since been changed to perplexing presentations. Same thing. But basically, these people decided to come up with a set of criteria which meant that certain children were at risk. So, for example, if your child has a perplexing presentation and you seek private assessment for them, that's a risk factor. If you seek an education and healthcare plan and they don't deem it necessary, that is a risk factor. It's literally written. If you are an autistic parent, that is a risk factor for being a parent that would be fabricating or inducing illness of a child. And as we know, the difficulties with CAMS, getting diagnoses, and
I was just about to say, like, it can take 2 or more years in lots of areas of the UK,
and even then you're only
to get an assessment.
Yeah, and you're only really then as good as the person doing the assessment. So if a child is not typically presenting or may have a PDA profile, they can't possibly be autistic because they're sociable. And we know the difficulties that there are around the kind of, looseness around, the triad of impairments and what benefits the diagnosis, and it's completely up to the individual.
So basically, in the UK, because you can't get a diagnosis via the NHS for several years, which is not the NHS's fault, it's the government not putting the funds and stuff there, then you still want support for your young person. So you're asking for an HCP, that will flag you as potentially fabricating induced illness. And then if you're autistic and would make the obvious assumption that your children are likely to be autistic too, if you as a parent are autistic, you're also at risk of being accused of
ableist, because none of this is actually based in any evidence at all. There are, I think, one of the leads at BASWA, which is the British Social Workers Association, looked over the last 8 years for incidents of fabricated induced illness where there was actually significant harm or death, and there were 2 cases, and neither of those were at the hands of the parent. So it's literally made up. It's not a diagnosis. It's not something that's quantifiable. It's not based in evidence. I don't want to be that cynical to say that it is literally made up to put parents off of exercising their legal rights on behalf of their children, but it is.
And it's also, again, it's because it's based on a medical model that as autistic people, we are people with autism spectrum disorder, as opposed to autistic people. We're not diseased or disordered. Okay. Before I do say that there's a question there, and I don't know whether.
Have you come across a situation where a teen cannot leave home and isn't able to access mental health services due to being discharged, does not engaging with services, also not being able to engage with school learning of any kind? Yes, I have frequently. We have a lot of families on our caseload that are in this situation right now. What I would say is that you probably want to pursue EOTAS via the EHCP. The difficulty with that is the EHCP is then relied upon the NHS and the local authority to do the assessing of needs. And it's a bit of a conflict of interest, because the local authority don't necessarily want to identify needs that they legally have to support. But yeah, so it's quite difficult. But yeah, also another thing to look at as well is Gecko community that I mentioned earlier. They have mental health. They like being called mentors, but to a neurotypical it would be mental health and wellbeing. And they kind of both of their mental health and wellbeing people, if you like, are neurodivergent, and they use gaming. There's also so there's a lot of different options out there. It is achievable because essentially, even with the system that we're working in, if the ideal would be for this child to be neurotypical and go to a school, there's a lot of steps that we can kind of tweak in a neurodivergent friendly way in the process, if that makes sense. But yeah, no, we deal with an awful lot of children that are really in mental health crisis.
And I think I really need to look into Gecko. So I need to have a conversation with you, I think, at some point, because not on the same level, numbers wise, as you, but obviously because I do a small number of private consultancy, just as a non-therapist autistic person to other autistic people and families. And it's the same thing. It's young people. And I was talking about this today. I want to work out what is happening. What is the common thread among the young people that I am seeing, where they are unable to leave their rooms or beds? And we're talking about some of them years.
It's severe, but it's severe.
And like I say, trying to find those other means of connecting with them. So, for instance, a lovely young person been talking to the family for several consultations, and we finally got to a place where just to introduce me to their young person, and the whole conversation was while they were gaming, and it was just based on the conversation about the gaming and what they were interested and things like that. So I'd be really interested to find out more about Gecko as well then, because
work that Gecko does is really it's really important. I think it's led by Mel Duncan, who's a autistic ADHD adult as well, and honestly we make so many referrals there, because I think, to be honest, it's not even anything particularly difficult to connect with an autistic child or an autistic young person. For us, it comes naturally because of double empathy.
And it does. Sorry, I don't mean to, it's because I was thinking this as well, like these fantastic families who are trying so hard to find any form of support are coming to me as a non-therapist because they've kind of tried everything. And you know, trying to explain, because they're so used to talking to non-autistic professionals, the way they have to explain their child, they explain their child in the same way to me. And then when I meet the child, I'm like, no, they're just autistic. I get this communication, you know, and they're not doing it to demean their child. They're just so used to having to explain it to non-autistic professionals. Like, my child, you need to give them time to process, and, you know, this kind of thing. And I just do that naturally. If there's a pause and you know, I've asked a question, I just wait. And it breaks your heart to think that people aren't even getting what we would class as basic. You just give that person time to process the information. And it's not because they're slow, it's because they're processing. There's a difference. Sorry, it's just something that's really hard.
I really don't find it difficult to, I don't want to say engage an autistic child like I'm some genius. I'm not. It's just that double empathy and that understanding of where they're coming from. And the difficulty is when the child's been through a mainstream school, they feel, even if they're aware of the diagnosis, they won't be aware of what that means. They are a broken neurotypical. By the time it gets to the point where they're not leaving their room, they hate their autistic identity because they feel that that's what's making them fail. And that just feeds into depression and suicidality and all the rest of it, which is, you know, that's why, I mean, I talked like Mel Duncan at Gecko and Manny Kimbo, brilliant. But they also do work around kind of gender identity and sexuality and that kind of stuff as well, because I think Nanny Kimbo is non-binary and Mel is queer. So they get a lot of, which is massively prevalent in the autistic community, and especially children that end up with Gecko because they've self-excluded from school for whatever reason, whether that be trauma, bullying, risk of exclusion, but they're all neurodivergent. And I think, again, it comes back to control. We look at, you know, autistic people, we don't do well with that kind of control and pressure. We need a bit of autonomy, whether we're demand avoidant or not. I think we all need a little bit of autonomy, and it's just not the way that traditional parenting is set up, or schooling, or anything really. A child has zero autonomy.
And that's why one of the biggest things I've learned as an adult, and I'm 37, and I only really, I mean, I understood about boundaries and I relatively put them, I'm quite a strong character, so I can, you know, say I'm not happy to do XYZ, that kind of thing. But learning about boundaries from an autistic counsellor was so big for me, and I think that is something we also need to be teaching our young people about autonomy and allowing their needs to be expressed, and then
accepting no and not first, basically. And understanding that that's okay, and that your child is never going to be neurotypical. And it's really gaslighty as well, because, you know, when parents all of a sudden realize or discover that their child is autistic, they think that there should be all this help available, and then the information that they are given to people that are supporting them don't want to spend any money, so they have what I call upside down coat hanger syndrome, which is basically toxic positivity about the situation. But they are coming from a model, from a medical deficit-based model. And, you know, I mean, how many times it's like, oh, Sandtimers, you need this, you need that, you need to be harder, you're too soft. And then what happens is you end up with a child that's not coping in school, but is trying their hardest, and then coming home, the parent is taught, and it's not their fault. That's all the information that's available to them at the time. I think it's Kieran Rose who always says when parents know better, they do better. And that's what we try and instill as well. But yeah, it's a lot for an autistic child. It's a lot. And
that's why I mean, to be fair, the two biggest two trainings of mine that's asked for the most are the fostering a positive autistic identity for well-being, and autistic well-being, what works, which is more about what therapies work and things like that. And I think your point as well, which is obviously very, very much self-promotion, everybody, but, you know, please send new families to us, to Aucademy, to send family instincts and things like that. Avoid that, you know, the culture of autism, which is just really horrendous, and it's really damaging for you and your young person's well-being, and if you're autistic, for your well-being.
My advice on that would be the best thing that parents can do is educate themselves. The best thing that they can do for their children is give them access to other autistic people, because that's how we learned how to be autistic and what that means. And just being simple things such as, oh, I do that too, when you've had so many years of feeling alien or othered, is massively is such a relief as well.
It's validating.
Yeah, it is. And children need that too. And then we have things like parents that are, you think they're really on board and they're pursuing this, that and the other, but you know, and their child may have a diagnosis pending, but they didn't actually think to discuss that with the child as well, because it's such a, it's given such a stigma. Like autistic has this massive stigma to it. I don't understand that personally, but that's probably because I'm privileged to be in a position where I can be openly autistic. But yeah, there's so much stigma.
And we do have a number of, I keep saying it because I need to get around to editing it, but you know, we do have some sessions on how do you explain to a young person that they're neurodivergent or autistic, or just explain difference in that positive way. You know, and because we had one of the sessions was, so these are all on YouTube, all on our Facebook, was Dr. Melanie Hayworth, from Australia, and she was explaining, you know, how to go about that, the actual practical things about how do you have that conversation with a young person. And what was amazing as well is that she said, you know, you might get it wrong the first time and then think not to try again because you're worried. No, you got it wrong the first time. That's okay. There's other, you know, you can try again and try in different ways. And actually had did some training recently where a mum basically said that, you know, she tried and it didn't go well. And I said, that doesn't mean you stop. It's not one discussion. It's not one conversation. It's, if you think of us as like when we realized as adults that we were autistic and went, not everybody goes through the assessment process, and that's absolutely fine. You are accepted in the autistic community by the majority of us. If you're autistic, you're autistic. But we went through a whole long process of working out what that meant. It wasn't one discussion. It wasn't just the piece of paper that says you're autistic, for instance. So we need to think more about that with our young people as well. It's not one conversation. It's multiple.
That's how we develop boundaries as well, by knowing ourselves. If we know what our sensory profiles are, if we know the things that we can do and we can't do, if we know why things are happening or why things are difficult, then it means that we can develop boundaries. If we're constantly thinking we're a broken neurotypical person, even though we may have the label of autistic, but no real understanding of what that means, then you were always going to push through and break.
And I think what's difficult, which I kind of see, I guess I see the perspective of some of those families that do struggle with the idea of labeling their child, and remembering, you know, I'm a social psychologist and everyone always assumes I must hate labels, but labels can be positive, negative, or neutral, and people assume label means negative. It doesn't have to mean negative. But your child, whether you tell them they're autistic or not, they are still autistic. It's just if you actually give them the tools and the knowledge, they might be better able to thrive as an autistic person. Still haven't got on to what is an EHCP, but go on.
Well, it's like if you're getting to the point with your child where you are seeking an assessment, then that is because there are difficulties somewhere. Something's not compatible. Your child will know that a damn sight longer before you do. And why would you not give them that information? To me, it's just, you know, if you've got an anxious child that may be neurodivergent, and you're running around and you're trying to arrange EHCPs and so on, why would you not actually spend that time to say to the child, well, your brain may be slightly different, and that's okay, and that might mean that crowded places are more difficult. For me, when it's a bizarre question when people go, how do I tell my child they're autistic? For me, it's no different to telling your child that you're left-handed, because they just are.
And I think that's quite a poignant point as well, because my niece is she's interesting because she's very similar to how I was at her age, but also she's quite similar to my sister. So we're both autistic, but my sister's a very different autistic to me. Her profile is different. She's got attention differences and the demand avoidant profile, and I don't have either of those. So there's a very different, quality to our autistic experience. But my lovely, lovely niece has always been, she started speaking very, very early, and she was very clued up on things. But she would be like me, and like lots of us, trying to work out and problem solve. And she was really struggling with making friends and keeping friends and things like that. And she would come home and cry and say, is it because I'm ugly? Is it because I'm this? Is it because I'm that? Would you really rather your young person thought that than say, actually, it's probably because you're autistic like Auntie Chloe, you're autistic like Mum, and it means that you will potentially find it more difficult for other people to understand you and things like that. Mm-hmm. And she was very accepting and understanding of that. That was taking away this really quite sad, she was trying to work out why already.
Yeah. And it's not
coming up with the wrong answers.
I think we're always this stigma as well attached to autistic people being antisocial. It's not that. I think there are just fewer of us. I think we're actually quite social, and we need that connection as well. And if you're being put through a mainstream school, not only are your sensory systems constantly under attack, you're constantly being controlled, but you're also, that you are not feeling connection with anybody because there's a distinct lack of neurodivergent people there.
And they are potentially there. It's just that you're not getting that. So what I see quite often is that if you give us the structure to be able to be sociable in an autistic friendly space, the friendships, they look different. They look different to what neurotypical friendships look like, but there is that connection there. I've lost the comment that did you want to put it back again, or have you lost it now? And we'll come back to that comment, and then we'll actually get on to what is an EHCP. So, I do like that. Sorry, say again. I
was waiting for the comment. Did we find it?
I think he's searching for it. He might have lost it. Oh, I found it. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
My child is home from school now, age 7. If he wants to stay home now, would I have a better chance of saving him from extreme burnout? He's starting to enjoy life again, which is beautiful to see. See, the thing about being autistic is you can never really avoid burnout and meltdown. It's not, it's just part of autistic experience, isn't it? And we have to experience these things to learn from them and learn what our boundaries are. Also, if home educating is something that you can do and you can deliver it and you can meet the expectations that are going to come from the local authority, absolutely do it. But it's a very personal choice. But your choice is essentially home educate or go down the EHCP route. I wish there was it shouldn't be like that, and it shouldn't be a battle, but it is. It's just, which flavour battle would you like?
And from what I think I saw quite early on in the comment section, Amy signed up to your passport, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. We created a SEND passport, which is, so if we do what is an EHCP?
Let's do that. Okay, everybody, what is an EHCP?
So sorry, I have attention differences, so I'm going to move around a lot. But an EHCP is essentially an education, health and care plan. It will replace the Statement of Special Educational Needs in 2014, and it was supposed to bring together education, health and care in one kind of contractual place to produce a document that was essentially a legally binding contract to support a child in education, health and social care with special educational needs. So realistically, how it should work is assess, plan, do, review cycle. So a parent or a school applies for an EHCP, and the criteria for application is has or may have special educational needs that may require an provision in the form of an EHCP. The problem with that is that the second part of the test may require an education and healthcare plan is actually a moot point in case law, because how can they know until they've actually done the assessment? So realistically, if let's say little Johnny is autistic, he's struggling with sensory regulation, he's struggling with communication differences. He may be struggling with working memory differences or attention differences. What should happen is that you should apply to the local authority and you go, my child is experiencing difficulties, please assess them. And reasonably, they should bring together within 6 weeks all of the different professionals to assess this child, depending on the difficulties they're having. And that should then produce a lot of documents and reports that should then be put into a contract of needs, provision to meet needs, and setting that can meet those needs. That's how it should work. But the problem is, local authorities, there's a real lack of accountability when it comes to EHCPs. So how it should work and what the law says is absolutely fine, but how do we actually get it to work? What can we do when it's not working? So appeals, there's 3 potential appeals in an EHCP process. You know, you have children that have been out of school for years and may have severe mental health problems because of burnout. They will get refused to assess. But essentially, it's all about money. So what happens here is, it's not whether or not your child meets the legal threshold, it's the local authority are kicking it down the road. So it then becomes a tomorrow problem because they're not having to pay people to assess the child. And then they're refusing to issue. And you may well meet the legal criteria, which is issuing an EHCP is necessary. So somewhere between useful and absolutely necessary. It's very low threshold. But all of this is lengthening the time in which the local authority have to pay for that support that the child needs. And that's what they do. And there's so many loopholes and underhand tactics. And then they may throw social services in to question parenting. And then they may pull a parent's medical files. Now, 8 out of 10 people have experienced depression and anxiety as an adult. And that then shows up. And then they go, well, you're an unfit parent. And yeah, it's very, very messy. It's really messy.
And I think even if that were the case, that it was a so-called unfit parent or the parent struggling, surely that still means that the child needs support in the school setting. So it almost sounds like, well, you're just making your own argument or supporting.
And what they do is they go, this is not an educational problem. This is a mental health problem. And when the mental health problem is fixed, they'll be able to attend a mainstream school again because they'll be neurotypical. So it's book passing. I mean, we've literally just had one, Heidi Maver, who's one of our admins, has just, her son, Matty, started with attendance difficulties, ended up 14 months out of school, made it all the way through to year 10, which was 15, being neurodivergent, and then just broke. So started with tics, burnout, and it takes a very long time but ended up with, and the local authority have just dragged her all the way to Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal Services for £25 a week in the package to pay for activities to do.
So basically to try and get out of paying an extra £25 to support that young person. Yeah.
Like, that's how ridiculous it is with the funding. I think it was Surrey that has got a projected overspend on just SEND alone of £36.5 million for this year.
And I think because it came up, so we did a little bit of work and training with our local council, different council to the one I'm actually in at the moment, and I'm not going to name them because I think that's going to be problematic. But they were great. They were really trying to make as much support with what they had, which, like you say, is an issue. There's not enough money, there's not enough resources and so on. But what was interesting is a number of schools that they were explaining. So this was the council were explaining to a number of schools, do make sure, because they were basically telling parents that even though their children were on the wait list for assessment for autism, so basically we were brought in, we did some training, some days and some, basic support, kind of educational support about what is autism things to families that were waiting for assessment because it takes such a long time. So we're talking about, I think it was around 600 children were waiting in Kent to be assessed. And that's not even because it's split as well. It's all very strange, and I had to learn all this stuff. But it was split where the very young children were under a different service. So we were talking about around 600 children were waiting who were aged, I think, 10 years plus, something like that. Yeah. And I was in on a meeting and I heard how the council had come up against some pushback because they were advertising and explaining to these families, you do not need an assessment or a diagnosis for your child to have an EHCP plan or an EHCP put in place. As long as your child has need, you can get an EHCP. And the schools were pushing back saying, don't tell the families that. And they said, but that's the law and they are allowed. And so the schools were pushing back because they were saying, no, we want to see assessments. We want to see diagnosis.
Is because so there's local authority. We've talked about the assessment criteria, which is really, really low, but schools have absolutely no right to appeal. So local authorities put ridiculous criteria in so that a lot of them get rejected. And one of the criteria is that a school must spend more than £6,000 additional to what they already receive for a child in order to qualify for the threshold for an EHCP. Now, this £6,000 is supposed to be what's called the notional SEND budget. And it's given, so for example, if you've got a large school with a few children with significant needs, your quid's in. But if you have a small school with lots of children that may have not that significant needs but still needs, so the £6,000 is a bit of a pie in the sky figure. Schools are struggling to pay teachers to keep the lights on. So for a school to then have to evidence where they've spent £6,000 to be able to apply for this EHCP, it's no wonder they don't want to do that. And then what happens is you get the EHCP, and more often than not, I mean, I think I was speaking to somebody from Southend, it takes a SENCO 25 hours to fill out the EHCP paperwork that they don't have. Which is not necessary really, because you're asking for an assessment of need and the local authority are asking SENCOs to do that and they're not qualified to. But it's all just designed to keep it, it's literally so corrupt how it works. Everything is designed to make you fail. But parents actually have more power than schools and local authorities. Our school refused a flexible timetable. I used the HCP to force their hand. Schools don't meet need. I had to use legal document to get it. Yeah. So flexible timetables is another issue, because you'd think that, but unfortunately, schools are under so much pressure to meet attendance targets. We know that this child might need a flexible timetable for a few months just to recover, and that's fine. But you can't do that, because if you do that, you've then got the EWO down your neck. So wherever you turn, school parents have a lot more freedom than schools, because schools are just told, no, spend this money that you haven't got and then apply. And then what happens is you'll get an EHCP with less provision than you're already providing. So we're not going to give you extra funding for it because we don't think it's necessary. And it's not to do with that. It's all literally to do with penny pinching.
And I think that's interesting as well, because the number of families now that I'm kind of like, please go to the Send Family Instincts page and learn about this, because, families not knowing that they can be the ones to set the EHCP in motion. It doesn't have to be the school.
It's actually better for families to do it themselves, because quite often with the local authority policy, schools do not want to rattle the cages of local authorities too much, because even though they get very little funding, the local authorities still are the people that dole it out. So if they annoy them too much, it's going to affect them long term as well. So I would not be like to be a school, to be honest, in this situation where they're trying to meet need and they haven't got the £6,000 and they can't rattle the cage too much, and it's just difficult. They're completely at the mercy of the local authority, who aren't experts in SEND.
And for those of you not in the UK, SEND is special educational needs
and disabilities, yeah. Although we did change it, because I kind of hate that. So we kind of changed it to supporting education and nurturing difference.
Yeah. And yeah, because it's not special educational needs. It's need. It's educational need. And
nurturing. And what do you need to nurture that difference? That is ultimately it. So we have a question. Can the EHCP have any sway on healthcare available? For example, I've been wanting to trial anti-anxiety meds for 2 years And due to the psychiatrist that covers our area, my child has been discharged without ever being seen. So this is a really difficult thing. It's laced in a lot of privilege, the EHCP process, and it's really wrong that it should be. But what you're asking for is essentially, when you go through the assessment process, you are asking for the NHS, who have no money, and the local authority, who have no money, to assess your child for what they may need going forward. There is a massive conflict of interest there. Massive. And if you're an educational psychologist, for example, and the local authority is paying your mortgage, then you're not going to cost those people money. So a lot of the times parents do have to access private services, which is disgusting, because that's the last thing you want to say to a parent. Please go and access this report at a cost of £1,500. But I've had to do it for my own children. You know, I think prior to Christmas, it was literally a case of, oh, damn, we need an assessment to get us into a particular school, or we need Christmas present. It really is that bad. Because otherwise you're left at the mercy of the local authority, which will then tie you in knots, and you'll end up with no education, and etc., etc. But with health, yes. So what you can do is you can go on something called national trial, which means that tribunal have the power to look at not just education, but also social care and healthcare. But what I would advise you do, if at all possible, depends on your financial situation, is seek this privately, pay for the first prescription, and then go via your GP via shared care route. That's going to be the quickest way to do it.
And what was that first thing you said? Something, was it something trial, did you say?
Oh, trial. So national trial. So when you're looking at an EHCP, the only legally enforceable bit of an EHCP is the education part, even though it covers education, health and care. And a few years ago, they started something called national trial, which is where judges were allowed to look at not just education, which is section F, provision to meet needs, but they were also able to look at health and care and make recommendations in that area. So while those recommendations are not legally binding, for example, if a local authority did not follow the recommendation that the judge gave, you would be then able to judicial review the local authority, which is straight to High Court. Don't pass go, don't collect £200. So yeah, it sounds really awful and really grim, but there are ways around. How do LAs and schools generally respond to private assessments? Depends on the school and the LA. A lot of LAs will say we don't accept private assessments. That's because if they accepted it, they would have to accept that there is a need. They would have to accept that they need to meet that need. Again, that's totally illegal. But it comes down to accountability. There is none. The only accountability there actually is going through tribunal. That is literally it. There is no other option. You can't even go to the local government ombudsman, because they won't even look at anything that can be resolved via Sendish tribunal. So local authorities do have all the power. So realistically, if you're a parent, what your goal needs to be is get into the appeal stages, because that's where the law comes into play. And a lot of the time what happens is parents spend an awful lot of time ping-ponging with the local authority and arguing with schools, and they may do this for years because they believe when they're being told their kid's fine and we're doing this and we're doing that and you won't get an EHCP. So by the time they get to us and their child is in crisis, they've not even considered an EHCP because they've been spending 2 years fighting with the wrong people. And they're completely out of spoons.
And I do remember that your advice, your strong advice, was stop worrying in the EHCP meetings with the schools and the representatives from the local authorities. Stop going backwards and forwards, just get it to appeal. Like, you're just wasting your energy and your resources and your time with trying to put things in place because the school...
They don't know. They don't even asking. They don't understand sensory needs. They don't understand autism. And if they do, either way, it's either willful incompetence or conscious incompetence. I don't know which is worse. Unconscious incompetence. I don't know which is worse. But basically, realistically, local authorities and schools like to gaslight parents into believing they have an awful lot of power. They don't. They can either give you what you know that your child needs, or you can go to appeal. and evidence it. But you can spend an awful lot of time arguing with the wrong people, and then you get completely burnt out. And then when you're burnt out as a parent and your child is burnt out and you are completely like losing it and really upset, then come in social services, you say that you're an unfit parent because you're clearly over anxious when you may have been fighting for about 2 years previous. So it's very much the thing that I would do about EHCPs. Can you do a parental request for assessment? Yes, you can. So in Wales, it's a statement of the special educational needs, which is what we used to have back pre-2014, but it's just education that looks at. But education can cover a lot. Anything that educates or trains. CBT, even though we don't like it, educates or trains. Speech and language therapy educates or trains. Social, and so this is where it benefits us really, the deficit-based model. You know, autistic people have a deficit in social communication. So a social, not that we do, I don't actually believe that.
I know. It's just, it still hurts. I know.
Yeah. It burns. But yeah, so, you know, us going to a social group, because that's one of our needs, could educate or train. Transition to adulthood, being out in the community, interacting with people, because we can't interact with people. Did you know that? So there are benefits in that way. Anything that educates or trains can go into that statement in section A. So yeah. So it's quite complex. I promise you it's not. No, it is. It's difficult. It's difficult, and there's a lot of noise when you move into this territory, and it's difficult to know where to focus.
What would you say, given the amount of effort and time and resources the family will put into this process, what would be your sort of, so like I just said, it sounded like when we were in that meeting, you just were like, stop wasting your time, parent, in arguing about the nitty-gritty and the nuance in this EHCP. Just stop wasting your time. You're wasting our time and your time and their time. Just get it to appeal.
Yeah. Because
so what kind of, I mean, obviously we want to send everyone your way anyway, but then you'll be inundated anyway. But yeah, but what would be your sort of key advice?
Key, know the law. Don't be gaslit. Don't fall into the trap of believing that Senkos and local authorities know what they are doing. Very rarely they do. They don't. They don't. They just don't. They don't have access to the knowledge that we do. Educate yourself and just know that you are not going crazy. You are a good parent, and that this is very real. And this is like when we speak about burnout, and you have to be aware of the level of knowledge of the people that you're dealing with, which is very, very limited.
Yeah, and I've really started to realise this recently as well, which is I sat in on a meeting that I was there, and I can't remember why I was there, and I wasn't sure they knew why I was there, or they'd forgotten why I was being invited. And I came in just at the tail end of another part of a meeting, and there was a neurotypical, I think, educational psychologist or something along those lines, talking about a specialist school and how they were talking about rolling out the zones of regulation across this specialist school. So for those who don't know about the zones of regulation, a little angry emoji just popped up. I'm wondering if that's because of the zones of regulation. Or at least I hope it's that.
Most of the problem is with the people, because the concept it's the nuance, isn't it? So the concept of teaching somebody to recognize when they're dysregulated is a brilliant thing. Do it. But it's like the neurotypicals just ruin it. You know, yeah.
So basically they said that, and they were just talking about, thinking about rolling out the zones of regulation across this school, specialist school, which means lots of autistic children, children with attention differences and so on. And like I say, I wasn't really meant to be part of that meeting, but I typed in the type box and I was like, how many of those pupils think in pictures or don't think in pictures? And how many of them are alexithymic, so struggle to recognize or identify their emotions and things? And they were like, I don't know. And I was like, well, if you don't know that, say 3/4 of that school don't think in pictures.
I'm very surprised anybody knew what alexithymia was.
Oh yeah, exactly. That was my point. So yeah, they were like, we don't know. That's a new thing to me. And it's kind of like, well, then you're a specialist school. You can't roll out something when you don't even know what I class as basic information now. That's one of the, when I first consult with somebody, a number of questions I'll ask just to see what kind of thing they want to talk about and what advice they might want, that kind of thing. But I find out, do they think in pictures? Because it really impacts a number of other things. And yeah, so it's, you know, this idea that, and there will be some fantastic, you know, SENCO, so special educational need coordinators.
Yes, special educational needs and disability coordinators.
I hate acronyms. You know, there will be some fantastic ones, but usually they're fantastic either because they're neurodivergent themselves or because they've just taken such an interest in it that they've really, really looked into who they're supporting. And some people have gone into it, I guess, just for a job, or, you know, maybe they do really like kids, but they've not really looked into it. And they don't know this, what I class as basic information.
Yeah, and it's really difficult as well, because it's almost as if, like, the lack of money. I mean, nobody goes to work for the local authority in a social services capacity to screw over disabled children and their parents.
Yeah.
Nobody goes into teaching to tell a parent that they're going crazy and there's nothing wrong with their child, even though they may have multiple neurodivergence. So what happens is this kind of penny pinching and passing the buck. It's created this corporate culture of, it's really quite nasty. And, you know, and you've had, like, literally local authority employees been pulled up on Twitter for talking about how they beat a family in tribunal. And to me, what you're doing is just, if a parent is going through that much stress and financial pressure and admin work and a 5-month wait just to get to one appeal for their child, what parent does that if it's not necessary?
Yeah.
Like, where is the logic in that? I don't understand from a logical perspective why you would put yourself and your child through that assessment and that heartache and that exposure to your parenting and your life and having people in, and you wouldn't, would you?
No. Okay, so the key tips.
Yeah.
Say you're at the start, you've got a child who's starting to struggle and you're thinking, right, they need help in school. So what kind of key things should that family be doing?
So first thing is read the SEND Code of Practice. That is your Bible. That brings together all the law and the guidance into one place, and it basically is what teachers have to abide by. So you'll be looking at school duties and graduated response. Also, absolutely familiarise yourself with the Equality Act 2010, reasonable adjustment specifically. Because essentially a reasonable adjustment is defined by anything that has potential to remove a significant disadvantage. They really don't like that, by the way, but you can push things. Be that parent. If you are not that parent and upsetting somebody, then you are not doing your job properly. You are going to be that parent.
And I think for some parents there is that concern, isn't there, that not wanting to be seen in a certain way.
You can't do this friendly. You can't, because ultimately you are asking the school for resources they do not have. And that's always going to cause a conflict. And that's okay. And it's difficult, you know, and you will have disgruntled SENCOs when your child can't attend and they're threatening things left, right and centre. But you know, you have to, what I would also say is start the EHCP process yourself. Read in the SEND Code of Practice what the actual law is. Don't listen to people when they say that's not how it works in this local authority, or we don't get this and we don't get that. When the teachers in the schools are saying this stuff to you, they genuinely believe it because they are limited by local authority policy. But just follow the process. And what I would say is, for God's sake, please don't wait until the wheels fall off to start it. Because if you have 3 appeals, it could potentially take up to 18 months to 2 years. It's a long process. So as soon as you think that your child has a difference or a difficulty, get that going.
And I just saw as well that so many parents defer to teachers as if they are stuck in their own childhood experience. And particularly if you are neurodivergent yourself as a parent, you probably do have trauma from being
School
maybe an
trauma.
undiscovered neurodivergent person.
Yeah, and that's the thing, Amy. It's really difficult. And I think one of the things that I talk a lot to about parents, sorry, she's just said it's really difficult to be that parent. You don't, this is going to sound really patronizing, I don't mean it that way, but sometimes you have to be reminded that you don't have to lose your shit to be assertive. You can just say no, and that's not how this is going to go, and be at an impasse, and that's okay. That sounds really weird, but yeah, you have to be comfortable of just going, no, that's not good for my child, we're not doing that, thank you. And I'm sorry that you disagree, but I'm no. And that's also okay. And it's quite difficult.
And I really do feel that some of the things that families and parents are asking for, I don't feel like they really are asking for the world.
No, they're not. Not at all. Actually, what they're asking for is the basic legal entitlement. Even if if you start looking at human rights and right to an education, we're not even talking about the Equality Act. We're not even talking about what's in the Children's and Families Act. It's literally a basic human right. The statutory duty is on a local authority to provide a suitable full-time education. It's making that happen. I would also say is find other people that are in the same boat as you. But this is where the difficulty with the martyr parenting can come in, because it is really difficult. It is really difficult, and you are under attack constantly, and you're trying to be there for your for your child. So this is where the martyr parenting thing comes in. But also learn from, you are going to have to be the educators. You are going to be the wisest person in that room. You are going to know the most. So learn from people who've been there before. You learn from autistic educators. And just also let go of what you think should be, or how you think you should do things, And
I think, because I've mentioned this before as well on one of the lives, about the frustration in that one EHCP meeting that I sat in on, and just saying, why is this all focusing on changing the young person? Why is the young person literally being asked in the EHCP to learn how to interpret other children's meaning in what they're saying? That was one. It wasn't worded exactly like that, but pretty close. And I'm like, why are the young people around this disabled autistic child talking in a way that means that somebody has to interpret it? Why aren't we teaching the children around this young person? Because they aren't the only autistic person in that school. Even if it's a mainstream school, they're not the only neurodivergent.
Yeah, and that's really frustrating and really angering, and especially if you may be neurodivergent yourself, it's really unjustified, and you want to pick that apart. But I would say also remember it's a marathon, not a sprint. And if somebody is either willfully ignorant or unconsciously ignorant, you are going to spend a lot of spoons educating and arguing with them, and they probably don't want to listen anyway. So save your energy for something that a process is going to potentially be 2 years long. And that's why, I could see that in that meeting you were getting frustrated, the parent, and I'm just sat there going, nope.
There's no point. There's just waste of air. I guess my point as well is that, I can see the need to just not waste those resources. I guess in my head, I'm talking about what we should actually get in general, like across the board, is these schools just need to bring on us autistic trainers and neurodivergent trainers to just come in and teach the school about difference. And because I really feel that they would save so much money by doing it across the board instead of focusing per child.
They're so up against it, and schools are so up against it with no budget and having to keep the parents' kind of faith in them, and wearing the professional mask and expecting to be professional and give opinions on things that they're not trained to do. When you offer to educate them, their shield automatically goes up, and again it feeds back into this culture, doesn't it? We are the experts, we know what we're doing, and then next thing you know, you end up with a child that's at risk of exploitation because they've been missed for 6.
There we go. And again, it makes me think of my niece. I mean, she didn't end up getting an EHCP or anything like that. She ended up being deschooled. Is that the term?
Yeah, unschooled. Yeah,
unschooled. But when there were problems, and she was being bullied as well, and she was just spending every lunchtime in the toilet by herself, crying because she wasn't interested in doing the things her peers were doing, because she was just that bit older in her interests. So they were all still playing like wheelbarrows, using each other as wheelbarrows. And she wanted to talk about things, deep things, so she was getting bullied and things. And I remember coming in, trying to help explain to the deputy head, because they'd wanted to come and have a meeting with mum, have a meeting to see what Millie was saying as well. Apart from the fact she gaslit an 8-year-old by saying, well, I'm sure they didn't mean it that way. And it's to the child.
Normal for neurotypicals to do.
But it's like, please don't invalidate a child's feelings when she's crying and spending every lunchtime locked herself away in the toilet. Don't invalidate her. Believe her when she says that she's being bullied and she's feeling unhappy. And, we sort of asked, what kind of training gets done at this school about, autism things. Oh, well, we do it, and gets out this book called Asperger's Kittens. And I just was like, I'm sorry, what?
Me and Kieran had this conversation as well. So Kieran Rose is a really good friend of mine, and he's a parent, and he has children and I have children. Like, this is how weird it is, okay? So Kieran's actually deregistered his child from school and is homeschooling. Different set of problems, like I said. But they've literally got the autistic advocate right there. But because you're given a parent label, you are given that parent label. Sorry, my battery's going to die soon. But you are given that parent label. That means that you're instantly discounted. So I am having to pay Jodie Smitten to go to my son's potential school in September and deliver training that I've essentially said, okay, they need training in this area, this area, this area, this area. I could do that, but I am the parent. So
you're the parent. Yeah. And I mean, I came in and, well, at first it was like, hello, are you also a Miss Tyler? And I was like, actually, no, I'm a Dr. Farahar. Oh, doctor. And I was like, yes. And then, explained why we're there and had those conversations, shows me this Asperger's book. And I said, I would be interested in delivering some training for free to this school. Not interested.
Yeah. Oh, question actually, Chloe, because my battery's dying, so I'm going to have to go soon. Okay. When a child is already in burnout, how likely is it they will fight you to give EOTAS? So education other than at school looks really, really bad on local authority figures. So even though it's often the cheapest option, local authorities do not like giving it, because they are literally brainwashed into thinking that mainstream education is the gold standard and that's what should be the goal, which in law that's what EOTAS is. But fortunately we can only look a year in advance anyway. It's about the evidence. So if you can pursue evidence privately via an EP, via an OT, that says that this child cannot be in school because of X, Y, and Z, then you meet that the legal threshold for it. It is literally about the evidence. And that's where it comes back to the independent reporting. And if you can't afford that, you're in a really difficult place.
So basically, go over to Send Family Instincts and read up and teach yourself basically the law, and then don't waste your breath, get it to appeal.
It can be a long process. And this is why we start something called Passport, because for parents to advocate that, it's ridiculous. It's a legal process. You need somebody who knows that process, who knows all the pitfalls. And, there are some fabulous advocates out there, but you're paying upwards of £45 an hour for an advocate. If you're also paying for private reports to get what your child needs, to then throw on, I don't know if you're doing a content appeal, that's probably £1,200 on top of that, plus £1,000 per report. We started the Passport, which basically has every template that you need for every part of the process, even with like EBSA and the law around non-attendance and medical schooling. Everything is in there. And we also have like a dedicated inbox where we'll just check over documents and answer quick questions, because otherwise people were paying like, £45 to £65 for an hour's consultation with somebody. And we were just like, right, okay, the only way that this is going to get better is if we overwhelm the system by asking for what is legally, rightfully belonging to our children.
And I'm conscious that your battery's going to die.
It is.
It would have been nice that if we could have had a conversation about what school should look like, but then that's also kind of dangling a carrot that might not exist. Sorry, say that again. That's
an entirely separate conversation on its
own.
own.
So I'm going to ask my final question in a minute and hope you've got enough battery. So thank you so much. I think that's been really useful, the comments from people as well. And obviously, if you want to know more about this, you're going through this situation, you know, Aucademy, we're not specifically about EHCPs. We bring on different people. So you now know where Tanya is and you know where their advice exists. So
we do, like, every other week we have a free Send an EHCP live Q&A, so we get through as many of those. We have a social care one once a month as well with the social worker Mary Cartledge, and I think you share that as well into Aucademy parents group. So what we try and do is get around as many people and help as much as we can, really, because it's the future of neurodivergent people, isn't it?
And we connect because we're online. We're here and we're mobilizing. Okay, so my final question, hopefully before your battery dies, which is we ask all our attendees what's your favorite stim?
Oh, favorite or most common? So my most common stim is this: constantly. You may have noticed that. I didn't even notice this until I started doing lives and watching them back. So I've done it for so many years I didn't even realize I did it. It's so bad. Favorite stim is probably dancing, actually, and music. So anything with a real beat that you can really get lost in.
The last number of guests have said music.
I think it's as well for me because it's like an ADHD thing and it's the rhythm and it's just, I don't know. I just need to move constantly. That's why I'm stood up talking to you.
It's fantastic. I do. I love listening to people's, I like this question. Just what are people's favourite stims? Because it's quite nice to share other people's stims as well. And go, oh, that's a good one.
I have like noise cancelling AirPods and I constantly have music in that because with my attention differences, it kind of helps me focus as well. But just having that music and that constant beat to kind of bumble along to really just helps me focus, because if you know me personally, you know that I have absolutely zero focus unless it's something that I'm really passionate about.
I was going to say, if your interest, your dedicated interest, is quite clear that you're very, very focused on it. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Tanya. I think that was there was lots of comments. I know there were some comments that it's frustrating and probably really, really struggling families, but
jump over to Send Family Instincts. We do have a Facebook group as well. We do have the lives. We are there. We're trying to get around as many people as possible. We even have a Facebook group that's got an awful lot of experienced parents in there, because that may have been like, I think we've got one parent who has six disabled children and she's gone to judicial review. She's got so many, it's achievable, but it's hard. But I think I always say to parents, what is the alternative?
This is true. It shouldn't be that way, but coming together and, like you say, if you're all got that knowledge as well, and let other people know as well, keep connecting. You find another family who's in the same boat, and don't let them waste their breath.
Every parent and it sounds really corny, but I say to parents when they're going through it and they're putting in complaints and going through appeal and they're dealing with shady local authority tactics, they're standing on the shoulders that have done it, of the people that have done it before, and then their experience is going to be able to help other people. And it's just like building that community and and also applying your knowledge of neurodivergence and an autistic experience to that system in a way that you can make it work for your child. It is possible. It's difficult, but it's possible.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Tanya. And so just to let you know, everybody, there's Oggy, Northern Naughty saying bye. So next week we have got Kieran Rose on. Kieran Rose obviously his dedicated interest is masking. But I said, can you come back on? Can we do masking again? Can we do what masking is really? Because we were starting to get frustrated by seeing quite simplistic infographics going around and memes about what masking for women was supposed to be, what the signs are. And it's frustrating because
for a mask, and
masking is not a gendered experience. All genders for autistic people.
It's literally
exactly. Yeah, so we're literally going to do what is masking really. Let's dispel the myths. Let's stop thinking of it in the ways that it's being portrayed at the moment. So we're going to do that next week with Kieran Rose, who is the autistic advocate. So thank you all, you lovely people. Yes, Northern Naughty is missing. No, are you missing the Eurovision? It's not started yet. Okay. So the Eurovision is on. So Tanya, you can stay there for a second before your phone dies. But thank you everybody so much, and we'll hopefully see you next Saturday.
See you soon.